and the struggles of ethnic migrant refugee communities. So perhaps let's rewind and start from there in terms of what a Tetiriti based framework brings to that question of commonality.
I think that, when we look at history in a lot of different countries where our ethnic communities come from, and the connection that they have in terms of the cultural activities and values that they hold there, and what is being held here in Aotearoa. With Māori, and the way we practice and value and protect our culture is very much the same, including te reo Māori. Te Tiriti o Waitangi is pivotal in the way in which we should be moving forward as a country and working alongside all the different groups, ethnic groups, and bringing everyone into that space where we're able to live in a country that can provide the peace, harmony that should be here under that umbrella of kaitiakitanga that's put in place by Māori. It is difficult for any group outside of Aotearoa to come into a country without knowing what te tiriti means and who to connect to, because it does provide a space aside from the normal colonial systems that have been in place, of which Aotearoa has been operating on and does continue to operate under the Westminster model. There may be a few changes here and there, but you and I know, coming from countries that have both been colonised at one point with that model, that unless there has been drastic changes within the systems, it will continue to recirculate. And what will happen is that the groups will remain divided and there will be minor changes, but those changes are not going to be helpful without those valued connections.
Thank you for highlighting our shared history of colonization. Certainly, when you think about just the magnitude of wealth extraction by the British from India, it is gargantuan. And that linkage of colonization and exploring that perhaps offers us a common language to engage with. Can you talk about that a little bit more?
I think it's important to recognise that when coming to Aotearoa, that the connection with Māori would have to be through colonisation. We have experienced a history that is so similar because the system that was introduced at the time was the same. And it's taken Māori a lot to try and tweak what's happening in the system. Is it where it needs to be? Definitely not. Do we need to elaborate on how the Te Tiriti is given effect within the structure of government organisations? We need to have more than just the say. And I would like to utilise the Department of Immigration as a classic example as to what needs to change to allow new migrants coming into the country access to information about tangata whenua and our role here and our language, our reo, and what the kaupapa was and is today with our engagements and communications out with different groups, because we share that purpose of many common strands like manaakitanga, āhuatanga, and there is a purpose of wanting to embrace manuhiri. But it's also about how the manuhiri enters our space, and respect must be at the top of that priority for one another. The illusion that exists is the mirrored image that everything's okay and, we're just plodding along as different groups in different spaces. But the reality of it is, how do we know that? Do we engage with one another? Would Māori be able to walk into several spaces and feel comfortable about knowing we have a shared common interest, and vice versa? Out in the communities, what I've noticed is a larger increase of our ethnic community groups, diverse groups, but I still feel that sense of uncertainty and vulnerability when walking into those spaces, because there's been, before they've even been introduced to kaupapa Māori concepts, they've already been exposed to a process that doesn't connect us as Indigenous people to our ethnic migrant whānau that's coming into the country. And if it's left too long, all you're likely to see is all the stereotyping, the labelling, the racism that's occurred. Often the only communication between us and our ethnic people is through media. And you and I both know that is not the best form of information sharing for people to get that connection from. And so there should be a concentration on what that looks like. And how do we work to improve those strands?
So one of the things, Marise, you're highlighting here is the ongoing erasure of tangat whenua, questions of te tiriti, questions of kaupapa Maori from the broader framework of immigration. Now, you have outlined some of the consequences for this, but perhaps it would be good to also understand the underlying decision-making process that shapes migration that has led to this erasure.
And it comes from the models that have been previously put in place and continue today if they haven't been actually challenged. Having a co-governance Māori approach sitting across the board with many ministries, in particular my immigration, allows the involvement and engagement for Māori to then implement these policies and programs that can reflect such a relationship when new migrants are coming in. And also it helps to manage when there are issues that we've been facing of recent, reoccurring back into our communities that haven't been challenged, but are still coming across our borders and not being monitored and not being challenged from government level as well. It's important for Māori to have a space within these ministries that is independent and reflects a Māori view in line with the Tiriti o Waitangi. And it's important for ministries like the Immigration Department to uphold their obligation as a treaty partner.
So this is quite interesting, because if you were to push this idea a little bit further and think about this very empirical presence, for instance, of say white supremacists holding fairly anti-Maori attitudes who have come through the immigration process in different contexts. Would you say then that the anchoring of immigration in te tiriti would offer a framework for locating, preventing, as well as responding to this kind of anti-Maori sentiments, attitudes, and forms of white supremacy?
Well, one would think so, but the issue at the moment is it's obviously non-existent, because we are continuing to still bring that type of mentality and behaviour into the country, and too often we're dealing with it and it's become too regular. And the questions have to be asked, okay, if it's not there, then when will it be there that the ministries will embrace Te Tiriti and uphold its obligations by putting in place a Maori independent group that is able to share that overview of what the ministry's policy should look like and those decision makers. That is something both the minister and the CEO need to ensure occurs, because at this point in time, I don't see that happening. And the consequences of those the inactions that take place is that we're going to get an influx of that type of behaviour reoccurring, if not already. And I'm pretty certain you and I both know it's becoming more obvious in Aotearoa, of then evolving and becoming a lot more worse than it is now. And we'll be turning back the time clock into an age of which none of us ever thought we would see. So in my view, it's a serious issue. It needs to be addressed, and it needs to be managed. It definitely needs to be managed, and the accountability must come back to the government of the day on meeting its obligations. I don't believe I could stress any more than the fact that in this particular case with the Ministry of Immigration, they've totally dropped the ball. We are getting an influx of skilled migrants coming from particular countries that have a history, a long, dark history of racism and apartheid. And we need to be mindful that we've had incidences in Aotearoa already that have reflected that type of mentality and white supremacist behaviour. We also need to monitor ourselves to ensure that we aren't crossing over the line of reflecting what a mirror image might look like in terms of that. But in saying that, protecting the rights of the protecting the rights of the indigenous groups, and in this particular case, Maori, is at the forefront and should be at the forefront of the obligations of this government. And in doing so, that will help us as Maori have a voice in how and what could also be a partnership with our ethnic communities.
Beautiful.
Because we are here and we've always been, as mana tangata whenua, had an open door policy. And our aroha to embrace new people into our and onto our lands has always been that way until the dynamics have started to change. Well, they started to change a number of centuries ago, but they've even increased now. So we're almost like turning back the clock when we're dealing with the amount of racism coming in to Aotearoa. And we need to educate our ethnic groups, otherwise they may fall through the cracks and come out the other side talking of a similar language as the colonisers that once colonised their countries. And I am also seeing that, sadly, that a community, some individuals, not all, within that community could actually, if they were properly educated and informed about their relationship with Māoridom, probably go further in their goals and aspirations and building their own communities alongside Māori. And that worries me that that's not happening enough. It also worries me that have we touched the bases on the dynamics that also happen within other ethnic communities? Are we aware of those? What do they look like?
You know, it's powerful that you say this, and it's also deeply painful. You and I have talked about this, is when the colonial ideology, that ideology of whiteness, is reproduced in ethnic communities. So you take the trope, for instance, of the lazy Maori or the Maori on dole. these are colonial tropes,
That's right.
and they get reproduced within ethnic migrant communities, um, constituting a hierarchy, if you will, of raised bodies. And what you're suggesting here then is to turn to Tetiriti as the basis offers us an antidote to that kind of passing down of colonial ideology.
Correct. It must occur, otherwise, what will happen is they will adopt the same behaviours and mentality that is that of the colonisers, and that's the lens they will see it from. And a lot of that has to do with the inability for the government to hand over shared power. And even though it may be happening in some areas here, it's not happening fast enough, and it is not happening with the resources that come with it to allow Māori to have that free space and voice in amongst the ministries that make all the decisions. And one of the other issues of concern is the way in which we build our relationships globally with other groupings outside of Aotearoa in the trade space. What does that look like? Who are we trading with? Do they know who I am?
Mm.
And if those other ethnic groups and indigenous groups, and many do, are aware of Māori and our ability to move in different spaces, but is it enough that we appear at the table under a colonial construct? Or does it look like and appear that when we appear at those tables, is it really our voice? Or is it that of the servers? As servers, we've seen our history in the past. I think it's got to be really clear that when we have models that are set up like they are put in place by colonial systems, that still does not reflect the Indigenous voice.
Hmm. So, to the extent that we are having this conversation, but under the rules of the master, that conversation is framed by that overarching ideology of the master.
It is. It's always it's been that way since we got to tables globally, and even though we may have, um, you know, had a space there where Maori can sit at those tables, they are not necessarily sitting there with the voice of the Indigenous people, because that has, yes, I might be Maori and I might be sitting at a table for trade in the United Nations, but I am sitting there first as a public servant. And those two pathways need to be clear, because there are so many different angles when going into that global space and dealing with economics and trade centres, trade services, that we have to be cautious of. And one pathway of that process, it's about trading with other ethnic groups and other communities. And if you're not connected in culture as Maori are, how would you be able to reconnect with other ethnic or community groups or Indigenous groups?
Mm.
And when you look at the population and the amount of Indigenous people around the world, they're a pretty powerful group. And that's not what we're hearing all the time. We're hearing about world leaders that are non-Indigenous. We're hearing about constant wars. We're hearing about everything else, but we hear very little about the largest group of power players.
Mhm. You know, one of the topics we touched upon is white supremacy. And As someone who studies disinformation and hate, it really concerns me to see the flow of white supremacy in Aotearoa, and to frankly to see it flow both ways, which is sort of, if you look at the narrative of the Christchurch terror attack, you see how that has fed into a global ecosystem of white supremacy. So in the US attacks targeting the African American community, it's drawing from the Christchurch Manifesto. So this is incredibly porous and moving across borders. In this context, it seems to find a lot of fuel currently within the broader framing of the conversation around uh, Three Waters, the debate around that. So the question is, um, what can a Tiriti based framework offer us in challenging this both local and global onslaught of white supremacy?
I believe that Te Tiriti o Waitangi is the key to moving the country forward and upholding, holding the government to account. The issue really is for white supremacists coming in, there has to be the ability to keep them out, which means that there needs to be a robust process in place within the ministry that actually ensures that takes place. In regards to what's happening on the grassroots at the moment, and we've seen it, we saw it in some of the protests that happened in Wellington, and the ability for certain groups to utilise Maori insignia to mask that white supremacist behaviour. We've seen it when there is a laxed approach for immigration to do checks and balances before bringing people into the country and introducing them to Te Tiriti o Waitangi as an introduction pack. That alone is a form of racism. It must be something that we, as tangata whenua, mana whenua, must challenge and will challenge for change. We need to ensure that it's not for just our rights as Māori to hold the government to account, but to protect all our manuhiri that are coming here, that have a genuine, respectful approach to our cultural beliefs and values, so that we're able to work together, we're able to grow the economy, we're able to develop in a peaceful and harmonious way. If that does not happen, then we're going to have to restructure a system that's going to be more based around similarities to what's happened in Africa now. Well, previously with the farming wars with white and black South Africans, we will be modelling ourselves and setting ourselves up for that type of era. Because right now, what's been happening is the gearing up in white supremacist behaviour in Aotearoa, and it's not acceptable, especially when you have such a strong-held culture like Māori as the indigenous face of the country. And I think that needs to be recognised, acknowledged, and we need to move on it.
So you have been doing a lot in terms of actually countering this onslaught of white supremacy. I certainly have witnessed you engaging with Tangata Whenua on the co-option of Maori symbols, for instance, within white supremacist structures or movements. Could you speak a little bit on that in terms of particularly the role of education and the role you have been playing in educating the wider community?
Well, and I take this because we've had a number of influxes over the last, more so maybe the last 10 to 15 years of the behaviours coming in, and what's occurred from then is I've noticed, and many others have noticed, the streamline coming up. And it seems to be able to latch on to the vulnerable and the whānau, and I refer to even non-Maori, that are struggling. It's the struggling whānau that are trying to get better or out of the poverty situation. And I believe a lot of that's got to do, we aren't educating enough in this mainstream schools about racism. We often are too afraid to talk about racism because it's like a really bad word. And that's what we need to get past. We need to be able to talk about these in the education system and the way the behaviours affect others. No different if we were talking about a number of other issues that have occurred in schools. This should be one of the first ones, if you ask me. It should be adopted in the education framework. Otherwise, what happens is we get caught in all these dynamics of conspiracies, and we forget behind many of those conspiracies that we know of that's happened in the past is actually an agenda. And it's not necessarily been an agenda to bring us together. It's actually pushed further for divide and conquer, which has always been a strategy used with white supremacy. So for me, it's really important that we continue to advocate. We continue to talk about and call out the actions that we're seeing as those of us that are being on the forefront of a lot of protests for Māori kaupapa, and that we're able to see some of the things that some of our other whānau are unable to see, but are caught in that trap of illusions. And that's what tends to come in, illusions, when white supremacists bring their agendas forward. They're not necessarily coming out in the open like they've used to. They're actually acting behind a shield or a cloak that we may all be familiar with, but don't recognise when we are not in that space what it looks like. It's a bit like a Halloween mask. And I think we've had a bit of a taste of that with the protest that went to Wellington.
That's a tough one, hey? Particularly that ongoing work of pedagogy, of education, especially when whānau are struggling economically and financially, no?
If it's one thing we all have in common as human beings, is that we know what struggle can look like if we're at that same level. And it's too often that forces our places to take on board some of the issues that we don't realise are driven by other outside agendas that are really based around assimilation and indoctrination and racism. And unless we are able to continue to educate the different groups, work together, keep talking. Keep talking is a powerful thing. And less listening to what's happening on media.
Keeping that dialogue open. You know, where I saw that very recently with you, and I was just so impressed, was with the hijab issue, and sort of the kind of leadership you showed in creating that space for dialogue and conversation.
I think it's really important that we need to ensure that when our own ethnic or Indigenous whānau don't know how to approach the other groups, it's because they haven't had that involvement and it's new to them. And when often things are new to different groups and they're not familiar with them, it's a fear. We've got to learn to address that area front on in order for the barriers to come down. And by doing that, we've got to be able to support and show that there is a ability for Māori to allow the protective mechanisms to carry on through them. Only then will it open doors for the different groups to come in, and vice versa. They've got to want to make a difference and build those relationships, especially with tangata whenua here. And we need to educate them on what that looks like. We have a good relationship, Mohan. We've talked about many things. We also understand the dynamics of where this sits in the space of white supremacy and how its operational functions work, and the impact it has on other members of our whānau and our communities that struggle to understand that at this moment. And a lot of that's got to do with lack of access to information, lack of access to resources, lack of access to so many things, which restricts us and does not allow us to continue to progress with one another, often keeping us apart on purpose.
So it's that act of that moment of dialogue, which is actually an antidote, if you will, to the ideology of white supremacy and the disinformation it seeds, isn't it?
Very much so. We've got to keep ourselves, our minds and our thoughts clear from getting caught up in all of the conspiracies and the illusions that have been put out in public about what we look like, who we are, what we do and don't have to offer, or we're not even existent in those discussions. And there's normally a reason why we're not existent in those discussions, and on purpose. So, world's changing.
Yeah. And the thing about digital platforms is that their capacity and their logic to make viral disinformation and hate content. So it's like, how do you even keep up with? So if you talk about this kind of spaces for conversations, how do you build those? Then, because the logic with that is slow, it's going to take time to build. But at the same time, it's like we need to respond urgently, because what we are challenged with is spreading so rapidly.
I believe the key also to the puzzle, if you would call it that, Mohan, is the ability for ethnic groups and communities not just to rely on Maori to do all the hard work and the effort, but also to rely on ministries like Ethnic Affairs, the ministers that actually are there and supposed to be there to represent them, and all the other ethnic policy makers that are there, is having collective groups that discuss these things on how they can improve those areas and how they can improve those relationships. If you've got groups that are struggling with everyday living expenses and they are focused on that, they're not going to have the ability to address the obvious issues as to how the community gets to that point. And therefore, there must be a place in which the ethnic communities and groups can also call on their MPs and their ministers to start being the voice for them, and advocates that they trust and know within their communities representing them. It's a matter of being able to direct those that are in the community to the right places.
So one of these components is really then ethnic communities to be able to develop collective voices, to be able to advocate for themselves and to hold our leaders accountable. There seems to be another part of it, which is the responsibility of ethnic communities. So for instance, my responsibility being on this land, in this space, to speak up and speak out against racism that targets tangata whenua. It seems like that is part of um, a responsibility one must carry with themselves as members of ethnic communities, as Manuhiri, when they are in this land.
Yes, and it's see, Maori are very in a strong point actually. They're at a strong place. We just have to keep pushing and pushing and pushing to get it to the boat to move a bit further. In terms of our ethnic groups, it's about them, yes, utilising those other access points in which they can improve their own rights to access better services. Um, but also, which has to be discussed, is about how they integrate, how communities, ethnic communities, are going to integrate that discussion of Maori te Tiriti into their communities. It can't be Maori integrating those discussions because the communication has to be done appropriately in the right way and at the right time. And that's the difference between the cultures that we understand. We're respectful of other cultures and vice versa. You can't just roll into every culture because everyone sees it differently. So leaders within the ethnic communities need to be responsible to take charge as to how they introduce te treaty with the support of their Maori counterparts on what that might look like.
Hmm. And this is a really great point, Maurice, because I think the way in which the colonial structure is worked out is that it puts forth a framework of biculturalism where it rules out the members of ethnic communities from the conversation. It's as if um, I, as an ethnic migrant, shouldn't have, ought not to have anything to say when it comes to the conversation on co governance, as an example. But what you are saying actually is that as Manuhiri, as a migrant within the space, it is my responsibility to participate, to first educate myself, and second, to participate in that conversation that engages with the concepts of Tetiriti.
Yes, it's very important because the issues that are deriving today are missing a lot of those concepts. In particular, when we are dealing with a lot of the racist issues that are coming up, like what's happened in Christchurch, like what happened in Wellington with grave sites, it's popping up and becoming too regular, way too regular. And doing so, um, to to allow the further education process to take place, the leaders within these communities need to be able to manage those engagement processes with Māori and directly with Māori so that that relationship can be built there for both community groups. And notwithstanding the fact that Māori are mana whenua, tangata whenua, and embrace that concept to allow it to also provide space for them as our manuhiri.
Hmm.
And I think that's really the key on building a robust, diverse, bicultural concept that can be moved within the spaces we're dealing with now. Because it's a yesterday concept. We should have been prepared a long time ago. Māori have been battling the issues on racism forever and a day since we were colonised. We had the colonisers come through, and we are still battling to get the Crown today to acknowledge that it must continue to uphold the treaty rather than it just be in theory and on paper.
Mhm. And you know what it also does is it decolonizes this kind of a superficial approach to multiculturalism. Um,
Yes, yes. And I think it starts back to where are our leaders within our ethnic communities? What do they look like? Who are they? If we are going to talk about some of the impacts and the relationships that can be built around these groups, some may say, Mohan, well, we've already got them in place, but then where? Because one of the biggest concerns is, even though I have concerns about the vulnerable and at risk, I'm aware that a lot of our migrant community groups and families struggle to understand even the language, the English language. Then my next question is there an alternative for them to learn Te Reo Māori? And the answer to that would be yes. It's a matter of how will they get that information and where will they go? And that's the type of approach the ethnic community leaders may need to look at. It's not for Māori to tell our ethnic groups what to and what not to do. But if the advice needs to come from Māori, then it should be one that our ethnic leaders should be taking into consideration. First and foremost, exactly what does your engagement with Māoridom look like? And if it's non-existent, how will you make the first step available to make it happen for your people to be able to thrive in a country where the Indigenous people are in fact the first people?
hmm. You know, this is so beautiful because it also offers us a way to counter this kind of extractive relationships with tangata whenua that reflects the colonial ideology. And you and I have talked about Hindutva, for instance, which is a far right ideology, and that will often position itself as here in Aotearoa as aligned with um, um, Maori concepts in order to further perpetuate that racist ideology. And frankly, you know, the way in which I see that is that it's a way for this ideology to actually further perform that kind of extractive habit where it is taking indigenous concepts, extracting them in order to further its own agenda, and really disrespectful to tangata whenua. Um, so the framework that you're offering to Te Tiriti and really that deep engagement decolonizes that kind of extractive habit, if you will.
Yes, and that with the hopeful mind that it is going to allow them to think about what they do and how they do it in the spaces in which they work with Māori. There needs to be a very genuine approach on what that looks like. I think the biggest issue is when different cultures and groups arrive, it's coming here with their minds decolonized, not already colonized. Because if you enter a country like Aotearoa, decolonized, then you come fresh, willing to be open
Mm,
about how the Indigenous culture actually progresses and moves forward. I'll give you an example, Mohan. A lot of the difficulty that Māori have had in grasping with our Indian communities in particular is the disrespect that occurs around the purchasing of retails, such as alcohol retail stores, and placing them or opening them in areas that
mhm,
are of poverty. And when that happens, it continues the influx of that colonized mind thinking to reduce the mana in that regard of some of our most vulnerable and at-risk people by keeping them in that stage, because you've got gambling machines, you've got alcohol shops, more alcohol shops opening in the poor, impoverished areas where Māori are residing than in the wealthy, white areas where they are not. And those shops are being opened by our own ethnic groups.
particularly Indian groups.
Yes, and what happens is that causes alone a lot of issues between the two groups.
Mm.
And that is a discussion that needs to happen.
Yes.
And it must happen in order for a genuine relationship to move forward.
And one must also ask then this question, that to what extent is that behavior reproducing the extractive racist behavior of the crown?
Yes. And it's the ability to colonize the groups and continue to do that in those low, impoverished areas. And
That are
being
predominantly Maori.
that are predominantly Maori and Pacific Island. And then what happens is that the actual white supremacist viewpoint moves aside, and then it gets then forced in the lens of our ethnic groups that are coming in because of what's happened with the activity that's been brought on board.
Hmm.
And it has decimated and contributed to the demise of some of our indigenous cultural beliefs, Maori beliefs.
Hmm. This is a tough one, Marise, and then one around which there needs to be a serious conversation. And I also might venture out to then think, to what extent do these businesses that, for instance, are running alcohol shops in predominantly Maori Pacifica areas, are then supporting the Hindutva ideology or the Hindutva project?
Yes. And it's very damaging to Indigenous groups because we have the highest stats when we're talking about our health stats. And then you've got domestic violence on the rise. You've got alcohol as a big contributor to a lot of what's happened in Māori communities, and stripping that whānau concept down,
Mm.
because so much violence has occurred through alcohol. And then we have the fetal alcohol syndromes in terms of health. And then we have to sit back and look at what actual contributions, aside by offering a few t-shirts for our sports teams and that, are our community groups actually contributing in a positive way? And it's very concerning, because while we are dealing with white supremacists to protect us all, that might be the case. But then again, on the other side,
Yeah.
we're dealing with our own ethnic communities coming in, and the disrespect that's occurring, it can't be ignored because there's a language barrier. There must be discussion between leaders as to what does this look like and what's the impact going to be on the vulnerable and at risk
Within the
groups
community.
within the community.
I also wonder, I mean, this is brilliant because from a social cohesion standpoint, I suppose one could argue that an anti-racist intervention is one of getting these shops out of the community, you know?
Yes, and we're not blinded to the fact that everyone wants to make business, but do you have to do it there? Does it need to be in the areas where majority of the whānau maybe are reliant on state care, poor health, high numbers of crime, domestic violence? We're already dealing with drugs along with alcohol, and so many different issues on the table. Does this need to be there?
Mm.
Should it be there? Is it also a practice you would in your own country with your own people?
Yeah.
And if so, have you learnt nothing from your own history about colonisation and the impacts and the detrimental impacts it's had on your own people?
It's really interesting that you bring this up because, one state that I can think of is the state of Gujarat in India that, in fact, produces a lot of these people that go on to set up businesses in other parts of the world, including in Aotearoa. And in the state of Gujarat, there are laws around alcohol. In most places, alcohol isn't available in Gujarat, and you have to go out of the state to get access to alcohol. So it is really interesting in terms of how that logic reproduces itself, precisely going to that question, that would you do that in your own home, within your own community? What kinds of norms have you built around that? And then you're coming here and turning this into a business opportunity that is deeply extractive.
Yes, and for me, the relationship between the two groupings will be strained if that's not addressed, because it is one of the biggest concerns. And if you're going to give or provide that product to the community of which you're serving, and that community has already been facing challenges, on the other side of the coin, what will come back from that is probably the crime that's going to be committed because of it.
Mm.
And there we have the high numbers of ram raids, and we're having the high numbers of shops being robbed and alcohol bottle stores. If you're going to feed them the fuel, well, you should not be expecting back a kitten.
Mm. And Maurice, then there is also um, the other layer. I mean, this is so layered because you have the additional layer of many Indian workers, Indian students being exploited, being underpaid within these businesses that are selling alcohol. There have been a number of stories with
Yes.
regard to that.
Yes, we've had, we were engaged with that on a number of cases where that occurred even in the Tairāwhiti region. And that's an issue. Once again, who's monitoring what's happening with the work visas and also the employment, Ministry of Employment? There should be some robust processes in place, but it's about us, our relationship with our ethnic communities on how we address these, because it has to be a two-way street. We don't want alcohol shops opening or bottle stores opening in low impoverished areas where our whānau are vulnerable and at risk. We don't want pokie machines in those areas where the money, instead of going into the cupboards for the families, is going in machines. We don't want them in areas where that's going to pose more harm. In the same token, the relationship between us and our ethnic groups must grow.
Mm.
And there has to be some robust conversations with leaderships within those communities.
It's really powerful the way you're articulating this, because in this framework, it appears that these alcohol shops, the gambling machines, are actually fundamental threats to social cohesion, if you will, within the community.
They are one of the biggest contributors to the demise of what's happening with our culture. And it's more about the mentality around continuing that behavior without even considering the impacts it's having on that community. And like I said, do we need them?
Mm. So, what policy frameworks at this point do we have access to, Maurice? Do you know, like, for instance, in the US, when I was working in underserved African American communities, we were working on things like developing zoning laws about how many alcohol shops can operate within a vicinity, things like that. So, do we have access to similar kinds of policy mechanisms here in Aotearoa?
Not enough. I do know that there is currently a new Chloe Swarbrick's bill was just pulled from the ballot box for discussion around alcohol. I think that there needs to be more discussion in terms of, well, who can actually open and sell alcohol and for what purpose. As you said, there's a lot of obviously stronger laws in India around having to go outside a certain area to access alcohol. Given the numbers of the deterrence that which alcohol has caused within Maori communities and Pacifica, the question needs to come back. Why do we need them? Why is it a need? And it's very destructive. Access to policies comes when groups come together and often file submissions in support or opposition or papers to cabinet. And I think that might be a good starting point, but the conversation needs to be had. I think first and foremost with Māori and our ethnic community as to what we might think is acceptable in our communities and what isn't.
Yes.
And collectively use that approach in a discussion with government. And now would be the right time.
We have been working on the violence prevention, Mahi, and one of the things that is so powerful to witness in there is that in community voices, there is a strong recognition of alcohol as a driver of violence. And yet again, within the whiteness of the crown structure, like alcohol is a second thought, and it's largely about individual blame and the power cycle and analysis of the power wheel, to then blame the individual that is committing the violence without really any mechanism for addressing structural issues like access to alcohol.
Well, at present, I would have to say that because it's still on the shelf and given the stats in terms of the violence and the negative stats on drunk driving and many other hindrances it's had on communities, I am often surprised why it's still available. And my thoughts go to, is the reasoning why it's still available because of the benefits that may come at higher levels, which don't necessarily trickle down to the communities of which it affects? And is that also a part and parcel of what exports and imports we come in with and go out of New Zealand? So from my view, I see that aside from that, it's also about the trade and exports. And we have to, regardless, protect what's happening in our country and the people that are living here. And violence has been at the top of the list. And there have been more crimes committed while people have been under the influence of alcohol than actually any other form of deterrence or contributing drug or otherwise problems that have occurred.
So this has been such an instructive dialogue, Maurice, and I want to move us toward wrapping up to then think about some of the key points that you laid out in developing a Tiriti-based approach to social cohesion. one of the starting points you said has to be that the Tiriti is anchored in every aspect of organizing of our society, and that includes immigration, that includes Ministry of Ethnic Communities.
It needs to be implemented in every organisation that's attached to the Crown. It has to be entrenched in every form of legislation that's attached to the system, so that it allows Māori to continue to hold governments to account in every avenue. And at this point in time, the treaty is not entrenched in every act.
Mm.
The other issue is revisiting a document of constitutional rights needs to be properly formulated, to be clear that we are not looking all over the country for different documents that make up what should have been a constitution. And the other issue alongside that is, do we want to remain a republic? Or do we want to be a republic? I think we need to consider those factors. At present, it may be the reasoning why we're getting so many structures that are still and always will be tailored to our Westminster model. So we've got a lot of work to do. We always got a lot of work to
Yes.
do. Let's start with the leaders and the ethnic groups first.
Yes. And really then to think about, because in one of my sort of critiques of existing leadership within ethnic groups is that sometimes those structures tend to reproduce power, which tend to reproduce whiteness. So I think also the question is, how do we cultivate a new generation of leaders from the margins who can engage with these questions of Tiriti and really build a grassroots form of activism and solidarity with questions such as, hey, what are we going to do with addressing these alcohol shops in our communities that are sometimes or in multiple instances owned by Indians in the community? Because clearly, here's the thing, Marise, to the extent that those alcohol shop owners are the voice of leadership of the community, we are not going to get change. So we also need to have to go in there and change those structures.
That's right. I think that's a very important point. I also believe, Mohan, that the voice to make change always starts with the people, those ones that are directly affected. So bringing the community together and having that discussion, and then out of that community comes that leadership, rather than appointed community leaders from areas that are based around profit. It must come from the voices that are affected.
Wow, there is so much in here, Maurice. Like when I think about the representation of the Indian community and who are the leaders in the community, and you typically see, and this includes, of course, the media, this includes the crown, you see the face of the business owners, the ones who have the capital and the money, appointing themselves and being appointed by the crown structures as the leaders of the community. And that can be incredibly destructive, actually, to sort of the question of social cohesion.
Well, it's a process that even the Crown adopts, even with Māoridom. So we are facing the same strategy approach together in that respect, not self-appointed or appointed by elite groups or those that are directly connected to decision makers, but those that are actually affected. That's the key.
Yes.
When we stick to that, no matter how many carrots are waved,
you're not going to be sold out.
You won't be sold out. And the kaupapa, the agenda for which we set it, will remain. When it doesn't remain, then there are the issues. You have to change regularly. So when the flavor of the drink gets too sweet, you need to refresh it. Otherwise, what happens is that I believe that triggers that effect that, well, the ability to be sold out is too easy. Change the guards all the time and make sure we keep the ones at the grassroots there. Otherwise, what's likely to happen? They forget where they came from. And that happens too often. That is the next segment of elitism. And we do need to stay away from elitism.
Wow, so much here to ponder upon. Thank you so much for this dialogue, Marise. As always, brilliant, incisive, and inspiring. Look forward to continuing this. Thank you to our audience for joining us. And there is so much here in this conversation to take away. And I do hope that we can find some action points from these conversations that can offer us templates for transformation. Thank you.
You knew all this anyway. you just needed a Māori girl to tell you.
Nah,
And
this
our
is
sense.
the one about the Indian liquor store.